Yeah, and so yeah, I'm going to. So yeah, as you can see, Rosemary is not here today. She has guests in her life right now, which is nice. Her son and family are here. Or not here, but in Santa Paula, I should say. Another Ventura person. But no, last week we talked about boats. We talked about Phoenician trading ships, which are believe it or not, more seaworthy than some of the things that we've got in our harbors. But yeah, the interesting thing about what we read about last week was that Solomon's greatness was based on his ability to turn ancient Israel into a trading hub. Knowing that Israel wasn't really rich with any natural resources, it didn't really have much space, not much land, which it still doesn't. But it capitalized on its position, its geographic position, even then, and Israel still does. So there's a lot of similarities to what Israel is doing today, which is using its kind of position in the world, bridging Europe and Asia and Africa together as a point. Obviously, to some extent today, that's less of an issue because our trading lines are not so much based on geography as we've gone online. The trading routes are now internet connections and hubs and things like that, which are really less dependent on geography. That being said, obviously ships still need to go through with resources and grain and all those kind of things. So the modern equivalent would be, what Egypt gets to make on the Suez Canal, or what Panama gets to make in the Panama Canal. There are still trading points where people can make money based on their geographical position. But Israel, understanding that so much of today's world commerce, is not based on geography, but based on the internet, has obviously taken a leadership role. We've discussed it, it, has taken a leadership role in web-based commerce and web-based development. And that's one of the reasons why Israel has been so successful over the last 20 years, because not because the internet is any stronger in Israel than it is anywhere else, but because the human capital, the investment and the support of internet entrepreneurs and in technology investment is so high in Israel. And quite frankly, one of the upsides of Israel being at risk, not just physically, but also because of cyber terrorism, Israel has taken a leadership in internet security, which is obviously of value to everyone in the world. Anyone who has a computer has to worry about internet security, and countries and companies have often turned to Israel for wait, Lynn, is Lynn in the parking lot? Yeah, thanks. I think she's in the parking lot. I guess the gate is a little sticky right now, so I think she thought Reverend Lynn thought we were not in person. I think. I didn't see her come in. Did you hear her come in? I didn't even hear her come in. Anyways, so the interesting thing is Israel has positioned itself in technology, through technology, to be what Solomon did 3,000 years ago. And again, we're talking about 3,000 years ago. We're talking about a period of time that was before the Greeks and Romans. Was she there? It was before the Greeks and Romans. It was before, there was the networks of connection that especially in the Roman Empire, stretched all over the Mediterranean and all over Europe and all over North Africa and all over the Middle East. That was a different level. But during Solomon's time, connecting the Mediterranean, at least the Eastern Mediterranean, with Africa, with the Middle East, especially the Arabian Peninsula, and going out to Persia, this was a substantial. These were substantial connections, but they were not at the level during the Roman period. But that was 1,000 years later. So, this is 3,000 years ago, and the only major powers at that time in the world were the Egyptians. The Babylonians would soon be a major power, but they weren't a major power yet. And so you're talking about a really, really long time ago that Solomon, there she is, Reverend Lynn is here. She thought she was locked out, but she was not. And it's good to have you back, Reverend Lynn.
Thank you.
So we finished with the Queen of Sheba last week. And the thing that we read about the Queen of Sheba last week was that Solomon has this relationship with her, which, even during the Midrashic period and through tradition, was a romantic relationship, right? We talk about this great love. Yes, the Bible does not say there's any relationship whatsoever in a physical sense. It says that they had a trade relationship. And it says that she presented the king with 120 talents of gold, which we said today is, it's a lot of money. You're talking about, 1,000, no, not 1,000. About 1,000 pounds of gold, which is a lot, but it's not, but it's conceivable. It's possible that 120 talents of gold was a down payment on a relationship of saying, I'm going to be able to sell my stuff through your country. The fact that the Queen of Sheba is not named, she is the Queen of Shiva. That's the area that she was the queen of. The fact that she's not named, later on in some sources she is named, there are different names given to her. It seems like a title, like Pharaoh. The Queen of Sheba seems like the Melech Paro, the king of Egypt, or the Paro seems to be a title. So it seems to be that the Queen of Sheba was a known quantity, that she was important, that she was included in the story to some extent to raise the value of Solomon's rule. And so her connection to this story seems to be, it doesn't seem, I don't want in any way to say that it seems to be made up. Doesn't seem that's the case at all. It could be. We don't know for a fact. We don't have her records. We don't know exactly what happened. But it does seem like the reason that it's here is to establish Solomon's credentials, not the Queen of Sheba's. And we see that occasionally. We're not sure where it is. We say it's either probably Yemen area or it's in Africa. The Ethiopians believe that she is their ancestor, so there is definitely that. It's not a midrash to them. That is their life. As we mentioned last time, that's the basis for the Rastafarian religion, this idea that Queen of Sheba has a son with Solomon named Menelik, who becomes the first Jewish emperor, and later on they become Christian, and later on some of them, as we talked about, go back to Judaism. All of these stories, at least for the Ethiopian Jews and the Ethiopian Christians, are very important. We don't have any physical evidence. We don't have any anthropological evidence. We don't have any genetic evidence. But that is not to say that if you talk to an Ethiopian, they 100% believe it. And so there's no sense in arguing about it. That's their belief of their origin story. So it's not, I would never argue with anybody about it. But it is interesting because you will hear that from Ethiopians who 100% believe.
You would know more about it.
Yeah, but what's the point first of all, I would never do that to somebody and say your story's made up.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's just not nice. But the other thing is that
But I would.
Mike said he would. Mike said he would. No, he wouldn't. The reality is that it's not like it's a bad story anyways. It's this, the point of the story is to show that they're connected to the Bible. But yeah, this is not a romantic relationship, other than, again, in the Midrash, it becomes that. Again, you could say that when Sheba sees, or the Queen of Sheba, I want to say, she's never called Sheba. That's not her. When she comes, it says that she was impressed with him. The reports are true. Praise be the Lord. She seems very taken with it, and she seems even taken with God. I mean, that's the interesting thing, is it seems like she is. Where this gets complicated to some extent, which we did not talk about last week, but we will read it, is that there's a part of the Bible that is not often studied but often quoted because people love the lines from it. And that is the Song of Songs, which we sometimes call the Songs of Solomon. Now, according to tradition, including Jewish tradition, Solomon wrote the Song of Songs. They're love poems that he wrote. Now, some of those love poems, according to some traditions, were written about the Queen of Sheba, and that Solomon wrote some of them. Now, they are poems that go back and forth. Some of them are in the feminine, speaking to the masculine, and some are the masculine, speaking to the feminine. It's 5 chapters, not a big book, but it's a book of poems, a book of love poems, and it's fairly erotic, actually. And so when people look at those poems, some people, especially the Midrashic authors, some of those rabbis said they don't like the fact that we don't know much about the Queen of Sheba. We don't know much about the Song of Songs. So let's tie them together and say that that's where it comes from. So Solomon writes those. Now, Solomon, according to tradition, wrote 3 books that are still in the Bible. And I'm going to tell you that because we're going to get to the end of Solomon's life today. And we don't know a lot about Solomon. But the rabbis tried to fill in the blanks by saying that he wrote stuff. Now, the Bible says he wrote stuff. It says that there are proverbs attached to him, thousands of proverbs. Well, from that, the rabbis came to the conclusion that the book of Proverbs was written by Solomon, because we have a book of Proverbs, right? We also have the Song of Songs that we said is written by him. That's another book. And the last book that we say was written by Solomon is the book of Ecclesiastes. Why? Because the Ecclesiastes says it was written by a king of Israel. It doesn't say what king, but the rabbis really like the idea that Ecclesiastes was also written by Solomon. So these 3 books, according to tradition, were written by Solomon. What? Song of, yes, that a part of, right? Chapter 3, which we sing, to everything there's a season. The words of Ecclesiastes, the tone of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, that is turn, is actually a lot more positive than the rest of the book of Ecclesiastes. Most of the book of Ecclesiastes is fairly stoic at best, and actually kind of negative at worst. Like, what's the point? Because of that, according to tradition, Solomon wrote these books at different stages of his life. And the interesting thing about that midrash is it basically tells us that human beings change their vantage point, they change their perspective, they change their opinions over time, and they have different ways of looking at the world. So Solomon, as a young man, according to tradition, wrote Song of Songs when he was a young man filled with energy and sexual energy and love, power, that he wrote the Song of Songs to a woman or to women that he loved. Later in life, as he kind of matured and became a little wiser, he wrote the book of Proverbs. When he got to the end of his life and started looking at the life and said, what was the point of all this? He wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. So they actually say that he wrote these books at different stages of his life. Now, again, there's no basis for that at all, other than the line in the Bible that says he wrote Proverbs. But what's interesting about it, of course, is it tells us a little bit more about us than about Solomon, which is that if we sat down and wrote where we were at different times of our lives, it would sound different. And that in itself, I think, is a pretty powerful message, which is that we change, our perspective changes, our voice, the voice that you'd hear from us would change. And it'd be almost unrecognizable at different stages of our lives from that other place. So the story of Solomon, and again, the story of who Solomon was and how he wrote it, is an interesting one. We do not know a lot about him. We are in chapter 10 right now of the book of Kings. I will not ruin it to tell you, because we're going to get there right now. We're going to finish with him today, which means that from the time we're introduced to him to the time that we say goodbye to him is about 11 chapters, because David is alive at the beginning of this book. In the beginning of Kings, he's still alive. He transitions over in chapter 1 and 2 to Solomon, which means there's 10 chapters about Solomon in the whole Bible. And as we looked at in the last couple of weeks, not last week, but the week before, when we read about Solomon's dedication of the temple, there's 3 chapters, if you add the description of the temple, that are really about the temple and less about Solomon. The answer then of what we know about Solomon is very little. Why is that? Well, because we know a lot about his dad, is that we're going to see today. You'll see why. And as we mentioned, Rosemary is not able to be here with us today. I thought we'd turn this over to Judith, who's our other now Ventura backup. Our Ventura, no, she's not a backup. She's nobody's backup, but she's now, like Rosemary, in the process of establishing herself in another county. But yes, you weren't here for Judith's announcement, Reverend Lynn. She's not moving out of our lives. She's moving to Ventura.
I'm moving out of Santa Clarita.
She's moving out.
Really the definition. It's really the only reason, out of Santa Clarita.
Yes. And by the way, Judith, let's establish by virtue of looking at your life, Judith.
Mhm.
Not that this is your life, but how long have you been in Santa Clarita for, Judith?
Same as you, 23 years. No, longer. Sorry, 24 years.
Now,
Right? When did we get here? You got here in June. I got here in August. So what is that, 25 years ago?
Many places.
Yeah.
She's lived in Philly for the first part of her life, very established in Philadelphia. She lived in places, obviously, during college and during her early married life, including
Rochester, New York.
Denver and Atlanta, and Rochester, Denver, Atlanta. And at this stage of her life, Judith, what
Yes.
place did you live in the longest?
Here. This is the address. This is the address I've had longer than the house I grew up in. We had 2 houses. We moved when I was 12. So
The fact is
It-
that now, by virtue of length of time,
no,
you're truly more of a Santa Clarita in California than you are anything else.
no.
I want to bestow that upon you at this moment.
Thanks, Mark.
Judith, did you want to answer that?
What? I didn't hear.
Reverend Lynn want to know, is this a place that we'd all like to visit, the place in Ventura?
Absolutely. We will have Torah study there one morning, and we'll sit on the deck and watch the boats and drink mimosas and study Torah. I think it's just going to be lovely.
There you go.
However, the guest
With the
room,
reservation, you didn't get to hear, if you didn't get to hear that, Judith,
what did she say?
she said she wants to make a reservation now, so.
Well, the guest room is going to actually have bunk beds, like a dorm. Because I have a feeling in August next year, you're all going to abandon Santa Clarita and come stay in my guest room. You're just going to have to share. So we'll just put bunk beds in, like a hostel, a youth
Well,
hostel.
we wish you good luck on this,
Thank
new. When are you leaving, Judith?
Oh, we close in Ventura on October like 9th or something, whatever that Monday is. So I'm here for almost 2 more months.
Yeah, almost, but it's not a lot. It's all went down. This all went down in the last few days. But we're very excited for you.
Thank
And
you.
we will see. We will see you. We will.
Absolutely.
We're.
I've already made reservations at the Blazer Inn
Some
and
of us
Spa.
are plain jealous. That's what Reverend Lynn just said. Reverend Lynn just said some of them are just plain jealous. All right. So we are talking about money today, though. And we talked about ships last time, as I said. We showed the Phoenician ships, which we said actually have been proven that they could have gotten across the Atlantic. So is it possible that Phoenicians came to this place? Well, it is possible, which means that if people came during Solomon's time, then they could have come during Nebuchadnezzar's time 300 years later. And then as we said, it's a critical part of the Mormons' belief. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. Do we have any evidence for it? No. But based on what was recently done, I think about 7 years ago, a ship was sailed, a Phoenician reconstructed with the same materials and the same stuff. They did put on modern technology to help them, and to monitor them, but they did make it across the Atlantic in it. So it is possible. We don't have any records of it. The Phoenicians didn't write about it. There is no documentation that they did, and there's nothing we found left behind. Not that there necessarily would be if it was not, done in stone and fortunate, have the right location, whatever. But but the Phoenicians were amazing at their abilities to spread out and to sail to different places. And so we finished with last week, and again, Judith is going to read for us now. Once you take off here, which is how much tribute Solomon got every year.
Verse 14.
Yeah, the weight of the gold.
The weight of the gold, which Solomon received every year, was 666 talents of gold, besides what came from tradesmen, from the traffic of the merchants, and from all the kings of Arabia and the governors of the regions.
Yeah, now I just need to comment on this. The number 666 in Judaism and in ancient world doesn't mean anything. So of course people know it from the Omen and from just cursory understanding of black magic and demonology that 666 is a number. It is not based on Jewish sources, so there's no significance of 666 here other than it's a very easily divided number out of 2000. It's 1/3 of 2000. So it's based on the book of Revelations. Some people think it's based on Nero and on Roman on codes, ciphers to talk about the Romans based on Jewish numerology and on what we call gematria in Hebrew, which are number equivalents in Hebrew. Some people say, well, 6666, comes out to 18 if you add up the numbers. It has nothing to do with chai. It has the fact that there's 3 6s and 18 isn't significant. The number really is reflective of a third of 2000, probably. So it's a significant number, and 333 or 666. When you divide something by 3, this is what it comes out to. So it's probably more reflective of what some people thought, well, if it was 2000 talents, maybe he got a third of that. I mean, that's what the number would be if you did it on your calculator. What's important about this is it is a significant amount of money. We're talking about millions, in this case, the equivalent today of hundreds of millions of dollars that he received. Yes, and this is what he received. It also says what tradesmen and the traffic of merchants from Arabia and the governors of the regions were bringing in. So this is money that comes into the kingdom that allows people to trade there, to use his country as a basis for their trade, for people to be guaranteed something for the money that they're putting into this.
So you're saying it was the money allowed, it was paying Solomon and
Yep.
the environs so that they could trade it.
Yep. And so, well, No, it's payment to him directly, because it says it's in addition to what it's in addition to what people paid tax wise. So what is he giving people? He's giving people a safe environment to trade. So he's giving them guaranteed and secured trade while they're there. Why is that important? Because essentially, and this is what the Romans gave to the world, if people have safety and security, then they feel like they can do business there, right? So if people knew that if my goods pass through Israel, they'll be safe while they're passing through Israel, which means they're not going to be raided. The stuff will get there, because if you're a tradesperson in the ancient world, your risk was enormous. I mean, not only did you have to worry about ships that could go down really easily, but you also had to deal with raiders who could take all your stuff and you have nothing. It's not like you get something, you got nothing. If the stuff didn't get through, you got nothing on your investment. So this is really important. And people are saying, hey, look, if I have to invest in the safety and security of this king, it's worth it for me if all of my goods are passing through his territory. And that's what happened. And again, Solomon maybe was cheaper, maybe at a certain point was cheaper than some of the other regions where people would pass through it. Now, one of the reasons why you can pass through it is because, or you had to pass through it, is because of its location. As we said, geographically, you had to pass through there. The other issue is that for the most part, Israel has something that the other countries around it didn't really have, which is it had a flat area by the coast, which allowed it for ships to come in and for there to be a safe kind of like way of seeing what's coming in and what's going out. Whereas the Lebanon, it literally is mountainous. As soon as you get to the coast, it drops off and then there's no more mountains. But Lebanon is all mountainous, which is where the Phoenicians were based. Now they did fine, don't get me wrong, the Phoenicians were great, but Israel actually had a better coastline than some of these other countries. So Israel is able to trade from Africa, from Europe, from Egypt. Everything is able to pass through this area. And that's what it says he was able to do. And he was able to make a lot of money on it. But what he did, which the Bible says he did, is he invested it back in infrastructure. So he invested it back into this, into the country. So look what it says.
King Solomon made 200 shields of beaten gold, 600 shekels of gold to each shield, and 300 bucklers of beaten gold, 3 minas of gold to each buckler. The king placed them in the Lebanon forest house.
The Lebanon Forest House is it says Beit Yair HaLivnon is the building, is a storehouse that he built that was made out of Lebanon wood. It was cedar wood, right? So he took these shields and he made these gold shields, and he stored them away. Now that's savings. That's literally his storehouse of, these are not shields that were used. These were shields that were literally used as like gold bars at Fort Knox. These were his savings. Okay. That was not for anyone necessarily to see, but for people to know that he had this saved up, ready to go, ready to be cashed in. Here's what else he made. Now this is for show.
The king also made a large throne of ivory, and he overlaid it with refined gold. 6 steps led up to the throne, and the throne had a back with a rounded top and arms on either side of the seat. 2 lions stood beside the arms, and 12 lions stood on the 6 steps, 6 on either side. No such throne was ever made for any other kingdom.
Yeah. So this is his throne, which according to the Bible is amazing. There's 12 gold lions on this throne. It's made out of ivory and then overlaid with gold. So it's wealth overlaid with more wealth. The Midrash loves this throne, right? They love this throne of lions, which according to the Midrash were robots. that
Mhm.
could attack people if they came up and didn't have permission to come up the throne. So the gold lions could actually attack people if they were there to do the king, harm.
Wasn't there also a
Amazing. What?
wasn't there also a midrash that said the two lions closer to the arms would talk to him and give him advice and vice versa?
That is the lions that are at the very top. You're absolutely right, Judith. So there were six sets of lions, 6 pairs of lions, and then there's 2 lions right next to him that he put his arms on. And those lions were also magical and would give him information. So this is the throne of Solomon is considered to be his greatest thing that he built for himself. Now he also has a ring and a staff and or magic, but his throne he makes and has these, it has these powers to it that again give him even more power. So the throne of Solomon is something that people, uses in their imagination to, they kind of made it even bigger than what it was. But again, he also has some other magical devices. But these, he created them, and he made them even bigger, more powerful by the magic that were part of them.
Really great storytelling. Great
Yeah.
storytelling. He says that he was incredibly knowledgeable.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, and
the Democrat.
well, we'll see. We're going to read about the downside of all this because he brings all this technology, he brings all this wealth together into the country, but there's a price for this, and we're going to read the price. So interestingly, it's not the level of wealth that there's a problem with it, though, the rabbis will say that's part of the problem, but it's not by itself the problem. His wealth was almost, because again, God gave it to him, is not a problem. So God said, I'm going to give you the wealth. Remember when God asked Solomon, what do you want? He says, I want to be a good, wise king. I want to have good discernment. God says, well, you gave the right answer, right? I'm going to give you wealth. I'm going to give you power because you asked for the right thing. So if God gave this to him, it can't be by itself bad. We will read the downside. I promise you. You will. Here it comes.
All of King Solomon's drinking cups were of gold, and all the utensils of the Lebanon forest house were of pure gold. Silver did not count for anything in Solomon's days.
No, nobody even bothered with silver. It was all gold. Now here's the next thing that he built. Now we get into the infrastructure.
For the king had a Tarshish fleet on the sea, along with Hiram's fleet. Once every 3 years, the Tarshish fleet came in bearing gold and silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks.
Yeah, so let's look at what the Tarshish fleet is. So it says here, probably a large fleet of ships. Well, that's a possibility that it has to do with the size of it. Tarshish is a place, right? It's mentioned in the Bible. It's the place that Jonah says he's going to, right? Jonah is told to go to Nineveh, and he goes to Tarshish instead, or tries to go to Tarshish. So Tarshish is a place, most likely. I mean, we think today that it's Tarsus in Asia Minor, or it's possibly a place near Cadiz in modern Spain that was the far reaches of the part. Yep, that is possibly all the way out there. If it's all the way out there, it means that this is not so much the size of the ship, but the distance that the ships can go, how seaworthy they are, that they can go out for a long time. And it's more of a range issue than a size of the fleet. But the fact is that this is, we read it last week that Hiram of Phoenicia gave him ships. And then it says that he also had another fleet that he built. Why is this a matter of range? Because it seems like it comes back every 3 years. If it comes back every 3 years, it's sailing really, really far. Now, based on this description, it's also sailing to Africa. It's not going to Tarshish. So we don't say it's going to Tarshish. We know it has something to do with the distance it could go. But if it's coming back with ivory, apes, and peacocks, it's going to Africa. Ivory's coming from elephants. I'm sorry, hate to tell you, but that's where it's coming from. I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying that that's what he did. He's also got apes coming back, which are in Hebrew are kophim. Koph. It's not something you see in Israel. It's not a native animal. And the last word is tukim, is peacocks, could also be other kinds of birds. It does not have to be peacocks. Tukim could be like, again, the sound that it makes, like a toucan. A lot of these birds are named because they're onomatopoeias. So a tuki could be more of what the sound of it was. But these are not things that the gold and silver you'd see, wasn't too hard to get, but ivory, apes, and peacocks, that's probably coming from almost assuredly is coming from Africa. So these are ships that are coming and going very far distances. Now, here we go.
King Solomon excelled all the kings on earth in wealth and in wisdom. All the world came to pay homage to Solomon and to listen to the wisdom with which God had endowed him.
So it says that he had this tremendous wealth, but that he also had wisdom, and that, like the Queen of Sheba, these people came and wanted to learn from him. And that Solomon, this is where we get a lot of the midrash from, that Solomon is able to talk to animals, he's able to talk to angels, he's able to talk to demons, he controls angels and demons, he's able to get them to give him information that he's the only person that has this kind of information. There's legends about how he talks to, there's a famous midrash of the Queen of Sheba, why she was so impressed with him is, she did things like she would show him a whole bunch of flowers, and the flowers would all be fake except for one flower. And Solomon had to find the one flower that was the real flower. So what did he do? He talked to his bee, his favorite bee friend, and the bee would go and choose out the flower because the bee knows what's the flower. So he would talk to the bee. The way that Solomon used his powers, the rabbis like to say that he used them mostly to do good, but occasionally he got a little too full of himself. And so there's a wonderful midrash that in his attempts to control the demons, that they got out. And there's this one story that was written and then embellished, and there's lots of versions of it, is that Solomon tries to control Asmodeus, the king of demons, who figures in later Christian mythology as well. Asmodeus gets the better of King Solomon. He flips the table on Solomon, ends up impersonating Solomon, throws Solomon out, kicks him out. Solomon is, 1,000 miles away from home, has to make his way, has to make his way back to his house, his palace. And in the meantime, Asmodeus is reigning as Solomon. He's taken Solomon's form and is reigning as Solomon. Why is that important? Well, because we're about to read some of the horrible things that Solomon does. Exactly. And in this case, the devil was Solomon. So why do we even have this? Because we have a problem with Solomon that we're about to see. Oh, sorry. We kind of...
I'll start that part again.
Yeah.
All the world came to pay homage to Solomon and to listen to the wisdom with which God had endowed him. And each one would bring his tribute, silver and gold objects, robes, weapons, and spices, horses and mules, in the amount due each year.
Which seems to me, it's not just homage, it's actually a bill. I mean, it was invoiced. People knew what they were supposed to bring, the amount due every year. That's what Javar Shana B'Shana is. It was a fixed amount that they were supposed to bring them. So this is tribute. This is stuff that was brought but it was brought not because we like Solomon, but because this is the cost of doing business. And where does Solomon, and as we said, here's now the infrastructure.
Solomon assembled chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he stationed in the chariot towns and with the king in Jerusalem.
So what is this chariots and horses business? Well, it's a very Egyptian thing to do. It's a very Philistine thing to do. It's not a very Jewish thing to do, but Solomon did it. Covered these stables. Yeah. So we know actually that around this time, and again, I want to make it clear that for those biblical minimalists who don't believe that the story is necessarily based on fact, don't see Solomon's name inscribed on the buildings, but it's from the right period. And it shows us that there were these stables that were built in different parts of the country where Solomon or a later king, not too far away from him, made sure that there were garrisons and that there were that there was a military infrastructure in those towns. Those stables, those forts were there to protect trade. This is what Solomon had to do in order, this is what he did with the money. I mean, he spent it, he saved it, he used it for himself, he built a nice throne, but he also invested it back into the country so that it was able to do what people were paying him for, which was to make sure it was safe for them to travel there. The only way to do that is to have chariots and horses. And this is an amazing amount of horses. Let me not say it's an amazing amount of horses. It's actually almost an impossible amount of horses. Why? Because 12,000 horses means that there are 12,000, and even if some of those are for chariots, right? Two horses per chariot, so it's 2,800. That's still 10,000 horses that were used for soldiers. Now, for a country of Israel's size, even again, accounting for population and everything else like that, that's an amazing amount of soldiers. And even if you have more horses than soldiers, this is still an amazing amount of soldiers to. Yeah, but this seems like they are somehow connected to the chariots. Now, you're right. Mike said they've been used for farming. Absolutely. But this doesn't seem to be what they're used for, at least in this description. Actually, let me just see what it says here. Yeah. That doesn't help us.
The chariot drivers.
Well, see, no, so now that's interesting. So what Revelin says, sometimes they would use them. Now that's possible. But the thing that's important is that these don't seem, because these are, the word that's used here says Ba'arei HaRechev. Now, Arei is a city and Rechev is chariots. So these are chariot cities, chariot towns. That's why it says, translates them as chariot towns. These are forts. These are military places, which, again, if we're doing the math and we're saying, well, it's 12,000 roughly, it's like, and it's 1,400. So maybe there's like 12 towns like this, spread across the country, and each one has 1,000 horse. That's just still a tremendous amount of horses in each one of these places for the amount of people, because essentially, if these are not horses that are being used sometimes for farming and sometimes for soldier stuff, for military stuff, for police state stuff, whatever you want to call it, the reality is that means that there's 10,000, 5,000 or so, let's even say 5,000 professional soldiers that at any given time are serving the country as a police, as a military, as security, whatever you want to call it. That's a tremendous amount of people in the ancient world to be deployed for that. Is it possible? I guess. I have a feeling this is a little bit more imaginary than reality, because to maintain that kind of force, that many people, is very, very expensive. Now, again, he has that, according to this, he has that kind of money coming in. But for the amount of trade that was going on in those days, it almost seems like way out of proportion. But it does say he's investing it back into, if this is what he did, and if those are the figures of money he had, then he was investing a lot of money back into the infrastructure.
The
Becau-
next line says right there. The king made somewhere in the
Yeah, you weren't here for it, Marshall. You weren't reading about how much gold he's got coming into the country. But if he has that much gold coming into the country, he's not just saving it, he's not just spending it on himself. He is investing it back into the country. And that is, again, one could argue, one of the most important lessons for Solomon's success and for what we should be doing as well, which is that when you have money and you have a situation where you're not just taking care of problems or reacting to problems, that doesn't mean you stop. It means you invest back into bridges, you invest back into infrastructure, and you actually do spend the money to make sure that your highways are working, that your coasts are prepared if there's ever flooding or tsunamis and things like that. Those kinds of things have to be taken care of. Otherwise, the country is living in a fantasy that will be dangerous, because you can't live off of a really nice throne. And that's the problem that we sometimes have in our country without, again, not a political statement, it's fact. If you don't think about the infrastructure, if you don't think about what you need in order for a country to take care of its citizens and to be safe and to have a safe community, we're doomed. So this is a really good lesson for us. Yeah.
Verse 26.
Yep.
I'm being trivial, but it says, like in the third person, the chariot's towns with the king in Jerusalem. He is the king. Solomon is the king.
Yeah, but it is talking about him in third person, right? Because it says Solomon assembled. He doesn't say I assembled, right? So he doesn't say I did it. He says, so it is because of it, it's an interesting way of saying it, but it does. That's what the Hebrew says. V'im hamelech b'Yerushalayim. It is with the king in Jerusalem. So he has it outside, and it says essentially it's saying he has it in the countryside, and he also obviously has some of those horses there with him. It doesn't say that he had them all in Jerusalem, by the way. I think that's one of the important things. These are not to keep him safe; they're to protect and to defend. It does. So again, I don't want to repeat it because people can't hear you as well, Mike. Is that Mike saying that again? It is saying that they have his force in Jerusalem, but he also has it throughout. He has it throughout the country. You can see that the line in Chronicles it's I don't even know why they put that there. It's essentially the same thing, which is that he makes sure that it's not just in Jerusalem, that it's everywhere.
Mitigating circumstances which are not clear to me, why the whole country isn't wealthy, if there is this kind of bill in Jerusalem.
Well, part of it is that, again, it's the capital, right? And so there's going to be a disproportionate amount of the money that's going back to the king and to the people around him, right? It's the same thing that we have today. How much of our money goes back to DC? How much of it is then pushed out? Now, again, today you can make the argument that a lot of it is pushed out back to the other states. It's pushed back. It comes through Washington and then goes back out. That's primarily because we don't, we're dealing with money that's all going. It's all, yeah, but it's true. But it's also, by the way, going through computers, right? All of our money, it's not actually going in there. Our money isn't going there. It's not gold bars that's coming in there. It's all numbers that's going through on the computer. So that money that's going back and forth doesn't have to come. But back then it did. And so obviously the more of it that comes into a place, the more of it stays behind, right?
The Indian nation distribute do currently do.
So
Very wealthy tribes.
well, we had in this case, and this is probably part of the problem, that Solomon was trying to move to having more of not have it going through the tribes at all. And that's the interesting thing here is it doesn't say he gave it to the tribes. He didn't give it to the tribal confederation. He didn't give it to the elders. He didn't give it to the previous structures, which if you want to use the analogy, the tribes are like states. He didn't give it to the states. He gave it and he invested it back into these cities that he had as his administrative cities. So who decided that? It's gone. So it was somebody else's phone. So what happens is that when people when Solomon was restructuring the country, he took power away from the tribes, which we're about to see they didn't like, because he didn't do it under the old tribal confederation. He did it based on this region and that region. And we mentioned before, the analogy would be as if the United States government said, we're not giving it to the states anymore. We're giving it to regions. We're going to administer this out of regions, which, I mean, our government really couldn't do that. Thankfully, we don't have that as a possibility, but yeah, there's definitely, he's not helping the issue. So Mike says, is this the beginning of the north-south issue? Solomon's definitely making it worse, but he's making it worse to some extent by literally trying to rewrite the old rules, which are, we're not recognizing that at all. And that's what, look, that happens in countries today. It's not happening in America because we don't really have a way of doing that. If a president literally said, hey, I'm giving this to the military in that city. So let's say, or in that region. So let's say let's say our country, the equivalent would be saying, well, we're sending the money to Camp Pendleton. We're not really sending it to California. We're sending it to Camp Pendleton, and then Camp Pendleton will spend the money. So we're sending it to the soldiers there. We're sending it to that group, and then they'll spend the money because they're representing us there. We don't treat the military like that, though. I mean, look, we do. I mean, when a few years ago we were closing down military bases, a lot of that had to do with politics. You know, if somebody needed to, you know, the senator in the great state of Mississippi, they didn't close down Mississippi's military base. They closed down California's military base. You know, there were politics involved there. But the reality is we don't run our government. We don't run our government spending through military bases. King Solomon did. King Solomon had a military base in this place, and he sent the money there. He sent, this is where my soldiers are going to be based. And if the soldiers are based there, then they're spending their money there. They're spending money on food. They're spending money on women. They're spending money on clothes. They're spending their money there. So Solomon redistributed the wealth the way he wanted to. So this is really, it is important. And he spent obviously a lot of it in Jerusalem, which made people outside of Jerusalem not very happy. Now, there's a couple things you can do about that. You can complain about it. You can start a revolution, which happened. Or you can say, you know what? I'm selling my house up in Dan or up in Naphtali, and I'm moving to Jerusalem. Why fight it? And there are people who do that. There are people who say, look, I can make more money living in DC. I'm going to move to DC and I'll work for the government. There are people who do that all the time. There are people who, you know, decide that I'm going to go where the money is. You can fight it and say, no, I think we should vote to secede from the Union. Well, you know, that could happen too. But that's not what, during Solomon's time, people did, as we're going to see, revolt against him. So here's Solomon. Here's what else he does. And you can see this is part of his wealth.
The king made silver as plentiful in Jerusalem as stones, and cedars as plentiful as sycamores in the Shephelah.
Which is an area of Israel. The Shephelah is an area in Israel where there are a lot of sycamores. So what it's saying is that Solomon made sure that, you know, even though it says we didn't care about silver back in those days, it was like throwaway, right? You saw it everywhere. Money was plentiful. It's a phrase to basically say they were so wealthy.
Solomon's horses were procured from Mitzrayim and Kveh. The king's dealers would buy them from Kveh at a fixed price. A chariot imported from Mitzrayim cost 600 shekels of silver and a horse 150. These in turn were exported by them to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Arameans.
Yeah, meaning Solomon's dealers, not by the people of Mitzrayim, but once they came to Israel. So Israel was also dealing in military sales, arms sales, which Israel is currently very involved in as well. To some extent, it's not one of our favorite things that Israel is engaged in, but Israel will take American stuff, in some cases fix it up and put in Israeli avionics and Israeli technology and then sell it to other people. America's agreement with Israel is that only certain things can be done like that, right? They can't sell everything that America gives Israel or Israel buys from America, but there are things that Israel is able to.
Who do they sell it to? I didn't know that.
Taiwan,
Really?
places that America doesn't necessarily want to sell it to, but everyone knows that they're selling it to them through Israel. Taiwan is one of the big ones, but there are a lot of countries. So there are a lot of countries that buy military arms from Israel that were either originally built in America or based on American design, and then America's given permission to Israel to do this. According to what we know about the Iran-Contra affair, there were military goods that were going to Iran through Israel during that whole time in the late 80s, when Israel was working behind the scenes to get, because remember, the whole Iran-Contra thing was Iran, because we were not supposed to be giving any arms to or selling any arms to Iran, because Iran had been taken over by Khomeini, but Iran was in a war with Iraq, and we really didn't want either side to win, and we couldn't give weapons to Iran. So what we did is we sold them through third parties. In some cases, it was Israel that would sell the weapons to Iran. In some cases, it wasn't just Israel, but Israel would get these weapons to Iran. Why did we have to do that? Because Iran had all these weapons left over from the days of the Shah, which were only 5 or 6 years before, and all those F-14s and all those planes needed to be refitted and needed to be repaired and needed arms and all that other stuff. And in some cases, it went through Israel, which was crazy because Israel has been at war with Iran essentially since the Shah was deposed. No country is more on Iran's list than Israel. America's right behind it. But yeah, that's what happens. And we know it happened. I mean, it's been documented. So Israel in this case was part of the military trade, more of because of location. So these things came out of Mitzrayim, came out of Egypt, and they sold them to the Turks, or they weren't Turkish, but the Hittites lived in modern day Turkey, and the Arameans live in modern day Syria. So the stuff would come up from Egypt, pass through Israel. Israel would take a cut. Solomon took a cut on those imports, and those prices seem probably pretty accurate. Those are based on what we can see, or these are not made up figures. We also read that they got horses from Mitzrayim and, as Judith pronounced it by the Hebrew, Kaveh. Where is Kaveh? Well, it's also in modern day Turkey, we believe, Cilicia, which is part of Turkey, or modern day Turkey, but it's on the Mediterranean, on the Aegean coast of Turkey, across from Greece, but in modern day Turkey. That's where they got horses from. But the chariots came from Egypt. So Egypt was known as a place that made and built and sold chariots. And the horses, though, came from both the south and from the north. They came in to Israel. So Israel was buying and selling horses. These are all things that they were engaged in as part of their trade. So this is how they made their money. This is how Solomon made a fortune. That's the end of chapter 11. So it really began, the end of chapter 10. That began with Queen of Sheba and ends with this little kind of economic report. Chapter 11, the dark side of Solomon's. Here you go, Judith.
Okay. King Solomon loved many foreign women in addition to Pharaoh's daughter. Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Phoenician, and Hittite women. From the nations of which the Lord had said to the Israelites, none of you shall join them, and none of them shall join you, lest they turn your heart away to follow their gods. Such Solomon clung to and loved.
Yeah. So some of them were clearly made for, these were relationships with, they're definitely relationships with women that are political alliances. I mean, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, sending his daughter there for a marriage alliance is obvious. Phoenician, Moabite, Edomite, Hittite, these are all women that are in the region. You know, none of this is surprising. But again, the Bible said you're not supposed to do this. And it's not because they're foreign women, they're ethnically different, they're not Jewish. That's not it. It's that they will turn you away to follow other gods. It's not a statement about their ethnicity or their, nationality. It's about what they do, and they follow other gods. And Solomon's weakness is the women, that they were bringing this idolatry into his house. Now, this is why Solomon essentially is a devil made me do it kind of character, because why does he let this happen? Now, you could say, well, he did it because he had to. It was good for business. But clearly there's a downside to this, which either he didn't take into consideration or he just didn't think was that big of a deal. We know that Solomon loved the temple. He built it. He loved it. But his exclusive relationship with God was not there. And it was not there because he does not have, it seems, an exclusive relationship with women. Now, his father didn't either. His father, David, was married several times, simultaneously, to many women. He had a wife named Michal that he seemed to have loved and had a good relationship with her. She was King Saul's daughter, but they never had kids. And then he seems to have kids with lots of other women, including Solomon's own mother, Bathsheba, who he wasn't even supposed to be married to. So Solomon's not really doing anything different from the standpoint of being married to a lot of women. And David, by the way, wasn't only married to Israelite women. It says that Absalom and Tamar's mother, Maacah was not a Geshurite. She was a Canaanite. So David wasn't married only to Israelite women. But what it seems is that those women did not lead him astray away from God. Not the case with Solomon. Solomon followed his heart to their gods. And here's what happened.
He had 700 royal wives and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. In his old age, his wives turned away Solomon's heart after other gods, and he was not as wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord his God as his father David had been.
Yeah, that's the translation. And it's a fairly good translation. It doesn't say that he did not love God. It just said his lev, his heart, mind, his wholehearted, was not shalem, was not full, was not whole. So wholeheartedly is the word that we use in English. It's the same word in Hebrew. Wholeheartedly, lev shalem means a whole heart. He did not have his whole heart focused on God. Maybe 90%, maybe 80%, I don't know. But it wasn't only on God. He was not wholly devoted to God. Yes. It had an effect.
That one thing, David
For 3 years, yeah. So is it possible that he had this many wives? It is. Is it also possible this is an exaggeration? Yeah, it's a possibility that this is an exaggeration. Look, we knew from the beginning when God first warns us in the book of Samuel not to have kings because they're going to multiply their wives. Solomon seems to fulfill that prophecy
Tenfold.
better than anybody. But Solomon, the problem isn't that he's married to a lot of women, it's that they turned his heart away. So every time it talks about him being married to a lot of women, being married to foreign women, it's not the number, it's not where they came from, it's that they turned him away. This is the problem. And it says that his wives turned away Solomon's heart after other gods. And that's the problem. That's what Solomon did. And so Solomon's, well, let's look at what that actually means. What does it mean?
Solomon followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Phoenicians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was displeasing to the Lord and did not remain loyal to the Lord like his father David.
Now, similar language. Here's where it gets complicated. Here's where it gets bad.
At that time, Solomon built a shrine for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill near Jerusalem, and one for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites.
So he didn't just let his wives pray to these gods. The Bible just said that part of Solomon's infrastructure was building shrines for these gods. That's what the Bible said. The Bible says that he built shrines for them. That's pretty bad. It's one thing if you let your wife have a little shrine in her house and her own little area that she's able to have. But when Solomon actually constructs these things for the nation, for his people, what kind of message does that send? It's completely acceptable to worship these other gods. Yeah, you go, well, it's inclusivity, right? We're just being inclusive. We're taking care of the people in our kingdom, taking care of our queen. No, because these abominations, and that's the word that's used, these abominations, which in here it's the shikuts is the word. The shikuts is the word that's used in Hebrew for abomination. Which, by the way, is the root for word shiksa, just so you know. This is why we don't use the word shiksa. I don't. It's a funny word, but it's not a nice word. It's the root of it is abomination. And it's connected a little bit to idolatry. So, look, by our standards, what Solomon did was, religious inclusivity. But these places, they offered human sacrifices. That's not cool. It's not cool by our standards. It's not cool by our modern standards. It's definitely was not cool for the people who wrote this and who kept this story alive. The priests of God who said, our king is allowing these things to be built. Now, we got a problem because this is the second king of this line of David. So we got to be a little careful how we treat this guy. Because if this guy is completely off the reservation, to use those words, he's got a problem, and his whole kingdom his whole dynasty will have a problem. His whole legacy has a problem. So look, they're going to tell the truth. They're not hiding the truth that Solomon led people willingly and with, malice aforethought by building these things. He did the wrong thing. Definitely did the wrong thing. Did the devil make him do it? Was this actually Asmodeus encouraging this kind of devil worship? Well, the rabbis who wrote the Midrash definitely think so. No Solomon in his right mind would have done that. Was it Asmodeus as dressed as Solomon and looking like Solomon that did it? They feel a lot more comfortable with that, because to have this dichotomy in one person, to have this person who does all these wonderful things, who has a wonderful reign, who does the greatest thing imaginable for God, building God's home, building the temple. But he also built these little temples for the gods. It's not good.
Isn't it just kind of a normal process too, as we age and then talk about age here, that, we kind of just let go of a lot of stuff. And maybe he still had a very deep faith in God. It just didn't have as much meaning to him as keeping you to heaven.
But it's very possible that this is just the way people are. But we need to say at the same time, it's not acceptable, right? And so the people who wrote this have a real problem with it. They have to walk a very fine line because they can't slam him down completely. But this is a real serious admission. This is really, really bad.
Does he not come face to face with God?
Well, I will tell you this. You're not going to have to read much further to see what happens.
There you go.
No, it's a fair question, but you tell me what you think. So here's what it says he did. So again, if you didn't hear what Marcia said, is there an accounting for this? Does God hold him responsible for this? Let's see. Because again, well, let's see. Let's read it where it's not far away. But it says right here, Solomon did what was displeasing to the Lord and did not remain loyal. So for all the bad things that David did, and we read about him, he did bad things. David never stops belief in God and God alone. He never stops believing that there's one God that he's responsible to and that he is going to be loyal to. His loyalty to God is really one of the defining things about David's life. And even when God tells him that you've done wrong, he says, I know. I get it. Now, that's a significant thing, by the way, because it shows David's humility and it shows that David is accountable to God. Now, we're followers of David and we're followers of God, and he's on the right side. But understand what the consequences of Solomon's idolatry are. Number one, he's introducing and allowing human sacrifice in Israel. The rabbis don't say that here, but we read in other places that Chemosh, this abomination that was built in Jerusalem, that's still standing hundreds of years later, is a place where child sacrifice is done. Period. It's called the Valley of Hinnom, and it's being done later on by other kings in Israel. After Solomon, his descendants are occasionally sacrificing their own children on those thrones, on those shrines. That's what it says. It's what the Bible says. It's there. You'll see it. We'll get to it. So this is a problem. It's not a good thing, right? This is okay. Like even in our most accommodating tolerance for other ways, we're going to say, no, we're not doing that. So that's one thing. The other thing is that there's a problem here, which is when you worship lots of gods, if you don't like the answer that one God gives you, you go to the other God, right? And so Solomon, because he has the ability to say, I just don't feel like worshiping God today. I'm going to go worship Chemosh. I'm going to go worship Milcom. I'm going to go worship Ashtaroth. Now, a lot of people say, well, look, we're picking on the woman god, Ashtaroth, right? Ashtaroth is the goddess of the Phoenicians, right? That's Baal's wife. She's a goddess. It's what it says. It's a goddess. Clearly, this is not about the worship of feminine deities. Just want to make that real clear. You wouldn't have even known that if I hadn't said it, because right away it says Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites, and that clearly is a male god. Molech, Chemosh, these are all male gods. They're like Baal. Ashtaroth is lumped together with them. No, they're gods. I mean, that's like Adonai. For them, for the Ammonites, Molech and Milcom are oftentimes seen as the same god. They're both used here, but Milcom and Molech means king, right? It's Melech, the Hebrew word Melech. That was their king god. Baal is the god. Baal means Lord. Chemosh what the Moabite god was their main deity. So we have Moabite and Ammonite records where they were worshiping their gods like we worship our God. Same words, exactly the same kind of prayers almost are uttered to Chemosh or Molech as there are to our God. Now, again, there's people who say, well, this is just Jews asserting their God over other gods. I look, I mean, I'm repeating it, so I'm saying it. It's not that I don't want to deny that. Okay. But it's definitely not about slamming feminine goddesses. I just want to make that real clear, because there's one goddess and there's a whole bunch of gods mentioned. So this isn't, as some people say, destroying the divine feminine. It's not. It's about the whole package of idolatry. 100%. 1 out of 5 that were just mentioned were women. So it's not about the denying the women. There are people who say that, by the way. There are people who say that Solomon's temple and the people who built and the priests were against the feminist representation of God that existed. That may or may not be the case. They might have had a problem with that, but it seems that they really had a problem with any other God but God, but Adonai. The fact that that God doesn't have a wife, that's unusual. That's unusual. Did every Jew believe that? No. Lots of Jews believed that God had a wife at that time. How do we know? Because we found statues to that goddess everywhere in Israel. Everywhere. Every corner of Israel, we have found the goddess. Everywhere. So they didn't give up on the divine feminine. They continued to build, and create little statues and shrines to her. So they didn't stop.
It's interesting that she could have a statue, but not have a wife.
Yeah, well, probably because we don't know for sure, but the feeling about it is this. You're not supposed to make the Bible's pretty explicit. You're not supposed to make a statue of anything. If you're already believing in God's wife, you're already not doing what you're supposed to be doing. So why not make a statue to her? If you're devout, believe in Adonai that's without form, which again, I want to make it clear, did not go immediately over everybody. We know that because we found these idols. But if you're a follower of that, you're not going to make a statue of God. But if you already believe that there's goddesses, or a goddess, why not make a statue to her? Because you already are not buying the package. You're not buying that God is not seeable. So I think that's probably why. And it's again, we do have representations of Adonai, we do have representations that look very much like Baal. We don't have a lot of them because they didn't want it. They didn't want people to have it. But once they were already going to have a Asherah, after they're already going to have an Ashtaroth, if they're already having the woman, the Isha, if they're already having the divine feminine, they're already basically saying, God has a wife.
Is this why we came up with the idea of the
I mean,
Shekinah?
it's absolutely hard. What, Gail, what were you going to say?
Yeah, is this why we came up with the idea of the Shekinah? What is
Well,
it?
we have an idea of Shekinah, Gail, because we can't abandon, because people don't want to imagine God not being, having a feminine aspect. So yeah, it's part of it. But as Reverend Lynn was saying, it's hard to not see a God. It's hard not to have a God that you can see. And so people wanted it. But I do think that the reason, and again, my theory of why they have goddesses and not gods is because they're already saying, we don't buy into we can't have an idol. But I think it's also because the divine feminine representation was maybe something that people felt more comfortable seeing. I don't know. Why are there a whole lot more naked women in pornography than there are naked men? I don't know. Guys seem to want to see a naked woman. So maybe seeing a naked woman statue wasn't bothersome to them. I mean, it could be. This is what I think. I mean, I don't know if I can't prove it, but the reason why there are naked women statues all over the place is because people thought, oh yeah, it's a cool naked woman statue. It's a goddess. It represents something. I like it. But yeah, we don't see a lot of male representation statues. We have some. We don't have many. It's like thousands less. it's like a fraction of a fraction that we'd see a male statue that we uncovered in archaeology. The archaeology tells us, and again, you can see it when you go to Israel, the worship of the divine feminine in the statue form was so extensive. It was so prevalent that in some cases, I don't even think they bother talking about it because you're just beating it up. You're like I think like it's sometimes not in the Bible because they were like, what's the point? Like, why are we arguing about this? Because it's already accepted. So like people point out to the places where it is. It's not even here, by the way. Now, again, it could be because, we're not supposed to worship God, the divine feminine. But I don't know that that's always the case. I think sometimes they just didn't bother talking about it because it's like, you don't fight that fight because you're not going to win. There's so many people who don't want to hear that. You're better off not saying it. Is it mentioned? Yes, but it's not mentioned as much as you'd think. Because here it's talking about worshiping foreign gods and goddesses. It's not so much worship. It's not so much again, you don't see a lot of the text saying, and we don't talk about God and his wife. I think we feel more comfortable expressing that now because we know it's not. We know it was not accepted, or it was supposed to be accepted. But on the other hand, we also know enough about ourselves and the way we talk about things that sometimes we don't talk about things, not because they're not important to us, but we're like, why even bother talking about that anymore? So I think that that's also the case. And people now do talk about that a lot more. I see a lot more scholarship about it where the assumption isn't, they tried to do away with it and they were always trying to do away with it. I think they're sometimes saying they didn't even bother trying to do away with it during this period because it was so prevalent. So that's what I think you're starting to see. Again, it's not that they didn't know. But as Reverend Lynn says, it's very difficult to get people to the point of saying, we don't see God, and that's the God we're supposed to be worshiping, is the God that we don't see. So Solomon is hard at work building these things, and he built them. And read this thing here too.
And he did the same for all his foreign wives who offered and sacrificed to their gods. The Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him about this matter not to follow other gods. He did not obey what the Lord had commanded.
So it says God was mad at him, and God had talked to him 2 times. Once before he built the temple, right before he became the king, and then after he built the temple, and said, you did the good thing. Well, God actually took time to talk to him. God is not happy. God is not happy. So here's your answer to your question, Marcia. What is the payment? What is the accountability for this? How is Solomon held accountable? Here we go.
And the Lord said to Solomon, because you are guilty of this, you have not kept my covenant and the laws which I enjoined upon you. I will tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your servants. But for the sake of your father David, I will not do it in your lifetime. I will tear it away from your son.
That's a hard thing to hear.
However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give your son one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen.
Yeah, so I'm going to leave you something, not because you deserve it, but because David was such a good guy. And so this is the interesting message that the Bible gives us in the book of Kings, which is that David was so good that Judah continued to be a kingdom for a very long time because David was so good. Well, he's good enough that the people who looked back at King David said, David Melech Yisrael, Chai Chai V'Kayam. Because we still sing that today. David, the king of Israel, lives and will be established forever. we have this understanding that David should still rule 3,000 years later. Christians had the belief that David still had to rule, which is why Jesus is connected to King David. He's so good. He's so good. What? There's no way to ever prove it. But it's no, but there's the scripture says it. So you could say, why is David the ancestor of Jesus if God is his father? Because for early Christians and for Jews that they wanted to follow Jesus, establishing his connection to David was paramount. It's more important.
Interesting that there are no, biblically, no children of Jesus, which would, again, give you an opportunity.
Well, that's why we have the Da Vinci Code. That's why we have this idea that the Holy Grail is not a thing, but a person, that the bloodline of Jesus never went away. So for people, for that mythology to exist, which, gosh, I remember reading that. I read that, not the Da Vinci Code came out, fairly recently, but I remember reading the books that the Da Vinci Code was based on. When I was a student in England, I was reading these books about the Templars and about the Holy Grail. The books that they were based on, which they were not written as fiction. They were written as, as facts. Like these artifacts are out there, that these codes in these churches in Scotland that, have these how carry this line, and that the kings were really descendants of David.
There are groups of Christians who trace their ancestors to Adam.
Yes.
Fascinating.
Yep. And so people do it. We talked about the Ethiopians doing it through Menelik, through Solomon and Sheba. This idea that somehow if we could trace someone back to King David, then we would acknowledge them as God's chosen king. This is God's promise.
One of the daughters of Rashi books talked about, I think it was one of those, talked about the exilarchs.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So was there any writing / proof of any of those descendants making it
The
to?
exilarchs were the heads of the Babylonian community who traced their ancestry. They believed that they were descendants of the Davidic line. No.
Was there any kind of written records of that? And
No,
how long did they go for?
there were written records of their ancestry that would establish that they have a connection back to King David through the Babylonian exile. So they believed it. We don't know, because those connections are then broken, the connections back to the exilarchs. But I mean,
How long do they go for?
well, from that period of time, when the Talmud was written, we're talking about, that goes back 1,000 years from 1,000 years. So 586 is when the Davidic line gets destroyed, or the kingdom gets destroyed, and those kings get their descendants get exiled to Babylonia. That's 586 BC, and then the Talmud is written in 500 of the Common Era. That's 1,000 years of descendants that lived in Babylonian exile. It's possible, but I mean, I'm not saying it's not possible. I mean, it's possible, but that means that went all the way through the Greco-Roman period and everything else. It's possible. I mean, look, there were Jews living there, so they lived there the whole time, so it's possible. But the idea that they were descendants of David was established by the fact that was their authority. Their authority is the exilarchs. And again, they were called exilarchs because they were ruling in Aramaic. They were called the Reish Galuta, the head of the exile. They were the head of the exilic community. And yeah, the weird thing is that they were given a somewhat autonomy by the Babylonian, the Babylonians, and then we call them the Babylonian community, but it was really Persian community. It was the Persian dynasty, the Sasanian dynasty. Those dynasties acknowledged these people as kind of like rulers of their community. So yeah, I mean, they had power to some extent, but this belief that they were descendants of King David was very, very important. Now, Solomon is punished by God. But how punished was he, really? Let's read what happened.
So the Lord raised up an adversary against Solomon, the Edomite Hadad, who was the royal family of Edom.
Yeah. Judith, why? Because your Hebrew is pretty solid. Why don't you read the first 3 words of that?
Verse
Verse
14.
14.
Vayakem Adonai Satan.
So Satan.
You're right, Marcia, right? So this is the same word for Satan. Why doesn't it say Satan? Because it says very clearly that the Satan in this case is a guy named Hadad, who's from the Edomite royal family. The word Satan in Hebrew is not a person. It's not a title. It is a thing. I mean, it's a title, but it's not like a royal title. Satan is an adversary. That's all it is.
It's also not an uncommon last name.
Satan.
Yes, it is.
So-
You don't know the dots?
Oh no, Hadad. Oh yeah, no, the last name, not Satan. Hadad. Yeah, Hadad is a very common Middle Eastern last name. It's a Lebanese name. It's also sometimes a Jewish name. Hadads are could also be Armenian, but Hadad is in this case related to the god of the Arameans and the Edomites in that area of Syria, and this is Jordan. So again, Satan is just an adversary. In this case, it is a person. So the Satan is not Satan. That's all I want. Well, all I wanted you to see that the Hebrew word's there.
Just like the story of Esther too. His dad kind of steps in.
Oh yeah. In this case, this guy isn't even bad.
He is or is not?
He's not. Well, he's
Well, he has to have something.
yeah, but he's chosen by God. God raised him up. God made him powerful. God raised up the adversary. God did this to punish Solomon, and he punished Solomon by using other people. That's what it said.
They did that in Lucifer also.
Yes, but sometimes God raises up other people from other places.
So let me
To
just
do
ask
it.
you a question.
Yeah.
Solomon is older, it said, and now this guy comes in. So I'm just kind of forecasting here. He's not going to live long.
Well,
We're gonna make it
that's
okay.
what you'd think, right? That's a very good conclusion that you could draw from this, right? I'm going to only tell you, that's the problem, I guess. I'm not going to tell you. We're going to read it in a second. We're going to read what happens.
I'll fit your back.
Okay.
When David was in Edom, Joab, the army commander, went up to bury the slain, and he killed every male in Edom. For Joab and all Israel stayed there for 6 months until he had killed off every male in Edom.
That's pretty rough. Yeah, Joab, we know, was David's general, right? It's reminding us how bloodthirsty Joab was. Joab was a killer. He killed his own people. He killed David's son, Absalom. He is a killer, and he killed the Edomites. So what it's telling us here is it's giving us a little backstory on Hadad, which is he's like a lone survivor. Let's read this.
But Hadad, together with some Edomite men, servants of his father, escaped and headed for Egypt. Hadad was then a young boy. Setting out from Midian, they came to Paran and took along with them men from Paran. Thus they came to Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave him a house, assigned a food allowance to him, and granted him an estate.
Kind of sounds a little bit like he's a little bit of a Edomite Moses in reverse, twisted in a weird way, because he's preserved and taken care of by Pharaoh. But he is a lone survivor of a Jewish mass murder of his people.
But isn't this how?
What's it, the Egyptians killed the Jewish kids and then,
Yeah.
wow.
Isn't this how David kind of rose up as well? He was the young guy. Go get him. He wasn't even being considered. Wasn't that David?
Well, that's true too. David is the young guy, right? But this guy survives I mean, it's a massacre. It's terrible, right? And he flees to Egypt. Now, what's so interesting about this too, is it seems like 100% accurate, like this really did happen. And also Moses stayed in Midian, right? Moses fled to Midian. Moses fled to Midian and like this guy did, Hadad, and then settles in Egypt, where the Pharaoh takes care of him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, he gets a house.
And the food around.
Now, Pharaoh is playing both sides because Pharaoh has a daughter that's married to Solomon. Yet Pharaoh is keeping one of Solomon's adversaries or Israelite adversaries alive. Why is he doing that? Because he's Pharaoh. And you never know when Solomon's going to get out of line. And I'm going to help Hadad against. So you can see the Pharaoh is doing what politicians and what people do, rulers do, and still do to this day. You never know when I'm going to need somebody.
Betrayed.
Uh-huh. So this guy's got, he's being held by leverage because Solomon could say, hey, you know what? Send me that guy. I want to kill him. Or he could be saying, the king, if Solomon ever doesn't pay his taxes, I'm going to send this guy out to kill Solomon. So this is what Pharaoh did, played both sides.
Pharaoh took a great liking to Hadad and gave him his sister-in-law, the sister of Queen Tahpenes, as wife. The sister of Tahpenes bore him a son, Genuvat. Tahpenes weaned him in Pharaoh's palace, and Genuvat remained in Pharaoh's palace among the sons of Pharaoh.
Yeah, so he also gets to marry into the Egyptian royal family, Hadad. Now, this is some really interesting details. And we're getting these because there's a reason for it. We need to know about this guy and how the Pharaoh took care of Hadad. And
when Hadad heard in Egypt that David had been laid to rest with his fathers and that Joab, the army commander, was dead.
by the way, why
Hadad-
was Joab dead? Everybody tell me. Solomon had him killed.
Solomon had him killed.
Solomon killed him as soon as David died. Why? Because David told him to. David said, don't let Joab live. I know how bloodthirsty the guy is. Kill him. That's your first thing you're going to do when you're king. You're going to kill Joab. So Joab got killed by Solomon. And now he's dead. And so Hadad says to Pharaoh.
Hadad said to Pharaoh, give me leave to go to my own country. Pharaoh replied, what do you lack with me that you want to go to your own country? But he said, nevertheless, give me leave to go.
Yeah. So you can see that Hadad didn't want to stay in Egypt any longer once he felt there was a political vacuum that he could go back to his country. And according to this, Pharaoh doesn't want him to go. That's the end of the story for now. Though we've already been told that Hadad is going to be a pain in the neck to Solomon. But that's how he got to be a pain in the neck, because Solomon's enemy got protected by Pharaoh. And Solomon couldn't do anything about it. That's one.
Another adversary that God raised up against Solomon was Rezon, son of Eliadah, who had fled from his lord, King Hadadezer of Sovah. When David was slaughtering them, he gathered men about him and became captain over a troop. They went to Damascus and settled there, and they established a kingdom in Damascus.
Yeah, so there's another guy in Syria that was also raised up by God. So God allowed, look, the writers of the Bible want you to know that Solomon starts to have some foreign adversaries. And God God encouraged it even. I wouldn't say let it happen. God raised them up. God let them take power. And so these are people that Solomon's now going to have to deal with. And again, you can see his name was Rezon, but he had fled from King Hadadezer, which is very similar to Hadad. And Hadadezer means the help of, with Hadad's help. So Hadad is a god like Baal or like Adonai. Hadadezer is the help of Hadad. It's the same as we have Eliezer. Eliezer means the help of Eli, of God, of Elohim. Same name. So Ezer means help, help. God, with God's help.
He was an adversary of Israel all the days of Solomon, adding to the trouble caused by Hadad. He repudiated the authority of Israel and reigned over Aram.
Yeah, so this is Solomon's kingdom being chipped away from the outside. He's losing control of Syria, of Damascus. He's losing control of Edom. It doesn't really say what that meant. It doesn't really get into the details, but it was not good for Solomon. Solomon's losing control over the neighboring states that his father David made part of the country. You just heard David went into these places with Joab, his general, and wiped everybody out. And there's no problems. No problems during David's time. No problems during Solomon's early days. Now there's problems. Now that's bad.
But they're still not in the area of Jerusalem. They're in their own little.
Correct. These are the neighbors. And here's where we're going to finish with. Because, what's your point, Marcia?
Well, it's just that they're gonna come in.
Oh, it's going to get closer to home. And here it is.
Jeroboam, son of Nevat, an Ephraimite of Seradah, the son of a widow whose name was Zeruiah, was in Solomon's service. He raised his hand against the king. The circumstance.
Now, all that says right there is that Jeroboam raised his hand against the king. Now, that doesn't really tell us exactly what happened, but it does tell us that there's a rebellion.
But he wasn't part of those other people.
No, he's an Israelite. Jeroboam is, according to this, from the tribe of Ephraim, which is a northern tribe. It's a very powerful tribe. It's a very large tribe. It's a tribe that Joshua was a part of. Very powerful tribe. It's one of the Joseph tribes, right? Ephraim and Manasseh are the two sons of Joseph who were made separate tribes and very powerful. Both of them are very powerful. Manasseh's got two different sides, one on one side of the Jordan and one side on the other. Manasseh's big and Ephraim is very big. Very powerful tribes. Now, we're introduced to it and we're going to read a little bit more. But all you need to know so far is he raised his hand against the king. Now, that's a very obtuse way of describing this. But we are going to now read what happened. And this is what we're going to finish with today. So I told you, Solomon is losing control in his own lifetime of his kingdom. So I made the point last week. David inherits a kingdom that is split between the north and south. He unifies them. Solomon is born under that reign. You know, that circumstance where the country is unified. By Solomon's own life, end of his life, that has fallen apart. How do we know that? Because we just read it. Now, the Bible is not going to get extensively into it because this is a tragedy. This is a really, really bad thing we just read. That by David's own son's lifetime, this kingdom is falling apart. So I made this point. There is not one king of Israel that ever rules and dies from the time he starts ruling to the time he dies that ever ruled over a unified kingdom. Why do I say that? Because Saul's kingdom falls apart during his lifetime. David takes power of Judah. So David does not rule originally over all the kingdom. He makes the kingdom all under his power. By the time Solomon is dead, the kingdom's already slipped away. The idea of a unified kingdom is ever really never anything more than an idea, because it lasts for about 50 years. This is a problem that we have in our history, that there was never a real unified kingdom. Now, and later on, by the time of Jesus and by the time of the Greco-Roman period, there is a kingdom of Judea, that is roughly the size of North and South. So there is a period of time. During the time of the Maccabees, it's maybe not as big as, I mean, it's not anywhere near as big as what David's kingdom was at its height, what Solomon's kingdom was at its height. But there is a area of Israel that is roughly what Israel is today, that is a unified kingdom. It's a unified territory. It's a country. But not now, not really. And here's what Jeroboam does, and this is what we're going to finish with.
The circumstances under which he raised his hand against the king were as follows. Solomon built the Millo and repaired the breach of the city of his father David. This Jeroboam was an able man, and when Solomon saw that the young man was a capable worker, he appointed him over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph.
Okay, and this is where we're finishing. So Solomon rebuilds or builds up parts of Israel, right? Parts of Jerusalem, parts that King David started working on. Well, David built those things up. He built the temple, but he also built these other areas where there needed to be a building. Millo is one of those buildings. This is all going on in Jerusalem. One of the people that was there building was this guy named Jeroboam. He's a young guy. He's a capable worker. Solomon identifies him as a good worker. He's from the house of Joseph. And so he makes them over the house of Joseph, over those workers. Now, wait a second. Last week we read that Solomon didn't use forced labor from his own tribes, from his own people, that he only did it to the Canaanites. Well, I have a problem here because it just says right here that these were forced laborers from the house of Joseph. These were workers who were put in charge of building up Jerusalem, who were not from Jerusalem. They were from other parts of the country. You can bet that the house of Joseph didn't like the idea that they were there doing the work of building up Jerusalem. This didn't sit well with them. Now, Jeroboam is one of those workers, but he's already part of a workforce that probably didn't want to be there in the first place. And what does Solomon do? He puts him in charge of that. So who is Jeroboam? Jeroboam, to some extent, I'm not saying, I'm going to be very careful of how I say this. Jeroboam was probably not super comfortable doing the job that he was doing. Why? Because in some ways he's a capo. In some ways, he's the guy who's been put in charge of his own people to make sure that they do work for a king who they probably don't like very much in a city that's not their own city. You've made me you forced us to come here and build your city. That's who Jeroboam is. Very much like maybe some of these other people that we've read about in history who wind up being leaders of their people, who are at some point in their lives early on seen as being part of the system. Who am I talking about? Moses, who was raised as an Egyptian.
Well, I was wondering that earlier.
Jeroboam is a little bit like that. Theodore Herzl, who's part of the German, intelligentsia, German-speaking intelligentsia of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who dressed and looked like a pretty good Austro-Hungarian, assimilated Jew. Didn't speak Hebrew himself, didn't have a bar mitzvah himself. These are people who are the least likely because they're from inside the system. And I want to tell you, there's other people like that in history that we've seen more recently. And we see them because by their people at one stage or another, they were seen as sellouts. Nelson Mandela, it was at a point in his life, Gandhi at a point in his life, felt like he was part of the problem. He was an educated, he went to universities and was part of the system, was part of the colonial system. These are people who wind up being the people who lead the revolt. But it happens a lot. These are people who, again, at one point or another, were considered sellouts. That's what Jeroboam is. Jeroboam is a worker in Solomon's apparatus who's in charge of his own tribe and is seen by Solomon as a good person to use against his own, in charge of his own people. And now we're going to read about how Solomon's internal, the power comes away from within his own country. And then we'll read that next week. It's not it's deeply troubling because, again, as we're going to read by the time we get to the end of chapter 11, not too long from now, about 20 verses, Solomon's dead. But he reigns 40 years. So getting back to, and again, I promised I would tell you by the end, we'll read it next week. He reigns for 40 years. It's a long time.
Idea how Jeroboam becomes the size of a bottle.
How does Jeroboam become a bottle? How does Jeroboam become a bottle?
Good
There's not
question.
only a Jeroboam, there's also a Rehoboam. So yeah, these guys, these kings end up, or these, well, he becomes a king. They become names for giant bottles of wine. I think as you're going to see, we'll talk about it next week when we read about the confrontation between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. But this is it's a question of who's the good guy in this story. It's a really weird story because the Bible has a really hard time picking a good guy in this. And they basically say they're both bad, which you can't, you always have to have a hero, right? In every good story. But if it's a really good story, you're never really sure who the hero is. So if you're going to make a really good story and you're going to make the Godfather, you're never really sure who the good guy is. Who is the good guy? Who do you root for? The horse that got his head cut off? He was, well, he was in it too short. I just saw that again on the full thing on the plane on my way back from Israel.
I just saw that for the first time.
Oh, such a good movie. Godfather. It's so good. It's so good. Why is it so? It's so good. Every element of it. All right, everybody. This is a pretty good story too. And I will tell you, if you can't come back next week, your assignment for next week is to read the Annals of Solomon, the Book of Solomon, which we don't have anymore. Isn't it great when someone refers you to a book that you could never find? You'll never find this book. Well, I shouldn't say never, but we have no idea where this book is.
Probably in your library.
Go read about it. I wish if I could find the Annals of Solomon, that would be a major historic find. A book that we don't have, which gives us all the information if you want to read more. All right, everybody. Thank you, Judith, for reading, and we wish you good luck in this transition. Judith is going to be
Thank you.
is going to be starting the new year in a new situation, but it's so you weren't here, Marcia, when we discussed it.
She knows already.
Where did you see him?
The senior center.
Judith, I guess you're going to have to post pictures.
Okay.
I want to see pictures, Judith. Sorry.
All right.
Visiting Judith.
Oh, I already.
Reverend Lynn.
I told you, it's going to be like a youth hostel, just beds lined up.
Bunk bed.
That's okay. I'm on the bottom. I'm on the bottom.
All right.
Wonderful.
All right, everybody. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I see Judith and